Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Shirtman Worldwide.
Hello, good evening. Hello, and welcome to the TooFatLardies Oddcast. Once again, we're firmly locked down in the bunker on Lard Island and meeting up in hologram, beamed across time and space. I'm joined by the C3PO and R2D2 of Wargaming, Nick Skinner and Richard Clark. Gentlemen, welcome back to the Oddcast.
Boogity, boogity. Thank you, Sydney.
Hello, Sid. We've used that C3PO R2D2 intro before, I remember.
No.
We have, yeah. Not that it
No.
matters.
Sid, you want to get your scripts up to date, mate. That's
Yeah,
no
well,
good.
there were lots of Star Wars films, so it's okay to be, like that.
We can work our way around the good Star Wars films and the not so good ones. So I'm just trying to work out who Jar Jar Binks' mate is. So one of you can team up as Jar Jar Binks.
Right, that's you.
Big Jabba the Hutt.
I'd like to think of myself as Darth Maul, but I think that's fairly unlikely. Anyway, I digress. How have you both been?
What?
How have you both been?
Oh, very well, thank you.
Very well, thank you, Sydney. Enjoying the delights of still treating lockdown as lockdown, even though it isn't, if that makes sense. I don't think I've been out of the house hardly, apart from walking the dog, trying to avoid any other outings. Prospect of hanging around with people in parks doesn't really fill me with any great fun anymore, since I'm not 15.
And especially with the dog involved.
But I do see that things are starting to reopen again. So I noticed actually the Hartenstein Museum, which is one discussed before, I noticed it is now open. It's just a shame that you and I can't go, but if you're nearby, if you're in Holland, get your clogs on, get down there.
And I see that wargaming events are starting to reoccur in New Zealand, so that's still a bit of a shift for us to get across there. Perhaps we can attend in hologram form, but it's good to see that parts of the world are starting to see a return to normality. But yeah, no, we're still firmly locked down. And to be honest with you, I would be locked down anyway with the editing of Infamy, because we're very near sending that to the printers. But we're at, as of today, we're at about stage 5 of proofreading. Still another couple of stages to go. It's almost like a replica of developing a rule set. You play it and play it and play it and play it and play it until any bumps and grinds from the engine have gone, and then when you keep playing it until you think, right, there'd be no squeaks and noises from the engine, and so it's it all works and it's definitely right. And it's very much the same with proofreading. You keep going through various stages until you can't find anything that's wrong. So we're heavily involved in that, and really all the layout is done now, but it's just a case of polishing it up to try and get it looking as good as possible. And that is seeing me tied to my desk for a ridiculous number of hours per day. But it's a really interesting and important part of the process.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, discussions we've had about the words that people use, and internationally, of course, because rule sets are used internationally, the words that are chosen to go in the text really matter, because different emphases and nuances are applied across countries and across cultures. So getting the right word, using the right word, and consistently using that word through the rules is important in the way that people are going to pick them up and understand. And we've learned that from the past, and we're getting better at it. But I still think it's a really tough one to crack. What are you going to say, Sydney?
Yeah, I think a lot of the quality when you're producing any project is really in that process of making sure it's as good as it can possibly be first time that you ever release it. So ideas are fantastic, play testing is fantastic, and that's really the heart of the game. But what people interact with is, what they read. And if what they're reading has got typos in, it's not formatted well, it doesn't precisely come to them in a form that they find really accessible. they're never going to get the big message. So I'm afraid to say, Rich, you're doing exactly the right thing, but it is a painful process.
It is a painful process, and it's actually the way you have to write is at odds with everything that you were taught at school. Where, so for example, if you're saying Fred went to the shop to buy a cake, he went home with the cake, and then he enjoyed eating the cake, you would be encouraged in that situation to use 3 different words for cake, because you know, repeating the same word over and over again is not what you are taught to do at school. Whereas when you're writing a set of rules and you have to be precise, it has to be cake, cake, more cake. You've got to get the terminology consistent and constant right the way through it. And just little things like going through and checking that every time you use a phrase, it is capitalized or not capitalized.
Yeah, you're right. And that's, so things like group, unit, formation, things that you would, you know, words that you would use interchangeably if we were speaking to each other.
Yeah.
It's got to be consistent in rules, hasn't it? Because a group is different to a
Totally.
unit.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And then it's things like preparing the index, which I did. I don't know whether it was, I don't think it was yesterday. I think it was the day before, but literally spending the whole day. And you use a word search facility. I mean, I initially go through it and just take a big pile of paper and I highlight the keywords that I think are important that need to be in the index. But then you use a word search in a PDF to see how many times that comes up. You know, when you put in something like group, you know, the word group comes up 900 times in the rules, but you don't want 900 versions of it in the index.
Yeah.
So you have to go through every single one of those 900 uses of the word group and identify where it is worth putting it in the index, because it's important. Because, you know, so when a group is defined, you want to make sure that's in there. When you say what a group can do, but you don't want it in a passing reference, you know, if you are attacking group A, then group B will do whatever. Or maybe you do, maybe that's not a good example, but you know what I'm saying. It's a case of trying to identify when it's a key mention.
There's a real balance as well between turning something into, God forbid, a legal document where words, extra words that help explain something precisely, so there can be no doubt about it, and also keeping the flow of the rules. And that's something which, you know, when you're proofreading things, is a really important thing. Nobody wants to be reading sort of terms and conditions like you might get if you're hiring a car on holiday and trying to put a set of wargames rules. That was kind of the mistake that a lot of people possibly made in the 70s and the 80s, trying to find that scientific precision in what should be fun. So you've got a really difficult job. I'm sure you'll be great at it, Rich, but you've got a really difficult job because you've got to make it accessible, you've got to make it fun to read, and also you've got to be unambiguous. So again, there you go. Difficult job.
Often less is more. You know, when you're writing something, you need to be precise. And I have a tendency when writing to say what the rule is and then explain why that is the case. Actually, explaining why that is the case can often mean that you get potential room for ambiguity. You should really try and state the rule and leave it at that. And that's difficult to do, because, you know, when I write as an historian, you write what it is and then you write the reason for it being so, whereas writing as an editor of a set of rules, you really just need to try and write what it is. And if you want to have an explanatory bit, create that somewhere else. So for example, in Infamy, we've got a drill manual section, which isn't part of the rules, but it explains in great detail how drill works, because it's a concept that's really important in the game. But when it comes to the rules are quite precise. So I've tried to achieve the best of both worlds by keeping, you know, one thing as an introductory section and the other thing is, you know, the rules, which is good. And actually the rules are only about 30 pages long, which is fine, but the document is well, I think we're up to about 106 pages now, but that obviously includes 8 scenarios, a complete campaign system, all the troop rosters, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to get through, and clearly, you know, proofreading and going through troop rosters is a particularly tough ask, because it's a case of numbers, and numbers are very difficult to proofread. But all I can say is that every time we produce something, we try and make it better than the last time, and it's been great that the proofreaders coming back to us. The first thing they're saying is, "This looks absolutely fantastic." So it's good that when they've been asked to do a very specific task, they're still commenting on the layout and the look. So I'm really pleased with the way it's shaping up now. I really feel we've been on the 5 metre line playing about 20 phases of play over the last week, but we're now at the point where we can just push that ball over the line, and that's good. Might be another 5 or 6 phases of play before we get there, but the clock's not gone red yet, so we're all right.
To anyone who doesn't know about rugby, that might not make a huge amount of sense, but
Go and learn about rugby then.
Great analogy.
It's a game played by men with odd-shaped balls.
So, amongst all of the work you've been doing on Infamy, Rich, and indeed Nick as well, have you been having any chance to do any painting or?
No, I haven't had a chance to do any sleeping, let alone painting. Nick, hopefully you have.
Well, I've done very little since we last went to air, which was, of course, a little while ago. In fact, the last time you went to air, I was unceremoniously dumped. Not that I'm bitter about that whatsoever, but I did enjoy watching your interview that you had about Infamy on YouTube, both versions of it. The one before I pulled the plug out and the one afterwards were both good fun. I've been making some, what have I been doing? I've been making some Bandai 1/48 scale kits, which are nice. The tracks are a bit interesting because some of them on armoured vehicles have that kind of rubberized track that you remember from Airfix days.
I do.
Yeah, but they're nice. I like the fact that you can have different options on them with, various hatches being open or closed, or you can make the model the way that you want it to look, as opposed to just the way that it arrives out of the resin mold. So that's been good fun. I actually took the plunge and invested in my own Command and Colours game, because although we've played Command and Colours in the past, the version we've played has been the one owned by Richard, and of course at the moment he is however many miles away he is, up on his cloud somewhere, so we've not been able to play any games like that. So I thought, well, actually I'm going to better get my own version of Command and Colours. So I've spent, as anybody would realise with Command and Colours, I spent a fair amount of time putting stickers on little wooden blocks, which is a kind of rite of passage that many wargamers go through. But looking forward to playing that, and my son's going to be playing that with me, so that would be quite nice for us to do that too. But apart from that, on the painting side, not very much. I've run out of black spray paint, so I'm going to have to get myself down to Halfords or somehow to.
I tell you where you can go, mate. And this is going to be of huge interest to anybody who doesn't live within 5 miles of here. Get down to Blitz.
Where?
Blitz in St Albans, up near. I don't know what it's called. Up near Samuel Ryder School.
Right, yeah.
Where the co-op is, on that parade of shops. They're doing undercoat paint out the back door. You can't go in the shop, but go round the back and ask for Big Bert, and he'll fix you up with some.
Right, okay, well that's handy. I'm sure there'll be a big queue there tomorrow morning.
Yeah. I had to go and get some. And I'll tell you what I have painted, actually, and I'll show you these because I really like them. You can't see that. Let me put that on a white background. These are some...
What is that?
That's
a wagon.
A wagon with a load of hay on it.
Right.
And this is one with a removable load. I've painted them in my usual dog poo brown, so they don't... I'm not allowed to say the word shit about them. So that's one that you can put the load in and take it out. And here's a Roman engineering wagon, which they've all got horses with them, or bullocks with them. They're from First Corps. I really like them. And for Infamy, where some of the scenarios involve escorting wagons, they're really brilliant. And I had a chat with Martin at Warbases, who is doing a Roman wine wagon with a big barrel on the back on the cart. So that's going to be lovely. But these are really nice, and I like them. First Claw do some interesting bits and bobs.
First Corps do some nice things, and the scale of First Corps is like kind of a little bit less than 28 mil. It's more like
It is.
27, 26. More like what we call old style 25, but it's just a tiny bit bigger than the old style 25, and I think it goes really well with a lot of things. So they fit well with Perry's and Old Glory on the one hand, but I think you can just kind of get away with them with Dixon as well, and even up to some of the larger front rank figures.
I would say my airborne Jeeps, the infamous airborne recce Jeeps that I got from First Corps, sit very nicely alongside the Warlord ones. Actually, I think Warlord perhaps a little bit bigger than First Corps, but together they're very nice. What's that you've got there? Some kind of
two figures. This is a Foundry Roman, and this is this one here with a log on his back is a Roman engineer or whatever. And you can see that the size difference there is a size difference. Let's just put it like that. It's noticeably smaller. Here's another figure who's just standing. Now there is a size difference, but I reckon if you put a bit of plastic card underneath that, just 3 mil, 2 mil, and just boost up the basing, you won't notice it on the tabletop. And they do some nice stuff that.
It's never ever bothered me really, the fact that some figures are slightly bigger than other ones, because let's face it, they're kind of toys anyway, right? So if one's next to the other one is slightly different, it doesn't really bother me that much. I mean, if huge variances, it does. Yeah, but when you're looking at them, you're already imagining a real life thing in that version, aren't you? It doesn't really matter.
They come to life. They're not toys.
A millimetre smaller. Yeah, but only when you're asleep.
You should see the bloody mess they make. They drank 7 bottles of wine last night. I was horrified when I came down to it.
Well, it is worth saying, actually, that this is the Sunday morning where we would normally have been recovering from Operation Market Larden in Evesham. So considering, I notice you're wearing your OML T-shirt, Rich, and we ordered out a curry last night as a special consolation prize for not being able to be at OML. And this is probably the best I've felt on a Sunday morning after OML for many years.
Oh, I quite agree.
I did feel the same, although I missed everything about OML. It is a fantastic weekend, always has been, always will be. My liver certainly thanked me for not drinking the usual sort of like amount of beer last night.
2 pints.
It was basically 2 pints, yeah.
And a baby sham.
And I also enjoyed not having to queue up at that strange bar next to the But this will mean very little to our listeners in New Zealand and Australia. So on that note, I think we can just all look forward to next year's OML, which is a fantastic.
Yeah, next weekend I should have been up in Scotland for Deep Fried Lard, so I'm going to be missing that. But I'm going to be running a Kriegspiel game for wee Derek and some of his pals, and Alan over in Ayr. So looking forward to doing that over the weekend.
Fantastic. Well, more of those type of Kriegspiel activities later. But before we go to that, I think we've actually strayed into the workshop without announcing the workshop. But I did wonder if any of us have got any best bits on the bench. Nicholas, I'm guessing that rubberized tank tracks are not the best bit on the bench.
I haven't really come across anything that I would say is worthy of that. My curiosity is tickled by... I've seen some 3D printed World War II German cyclists that paint and glue miniatures have released. I haven't bought them yet. I'm interested about them because they'd be interesting. But whether they qualify for a best bit, I don't know, and I don't have them, so I can't say that. I'm just trying to find something to make me sound vaguely intelligent on the subject. But no, nothing from me this time. What have you got?
Well, I've been actually doing quite a bit of painting. I had a painting break for about... I've been at work, although working from home, so that's been fairly intense, actually, each day of the week. So that has been... that has been a bit of a pain trying to do it from home. But I have been painting in the commuting time every day, so I've got a fair bit done. But I haven't really got any new bits. I've got lots of old bits on the bench. I've been swapping around heads, and I've really found the bicorn heads that you can get to be a perfect fit for Dixon's and Wargames Foundry. These are the sort of bicorn English Civil War heads. So you take off the heads of the original figure and you've got a new head on, and that's just a fun way of creating different looking units. So that's an old bit on the bench. So those bicorn heads in 28mm bicorn miniatures, those have been really good value. But I haven't really got any new bits on the bench. But I did actually get, and telling tales a bit out of school here, I did get the copy of Infamy from Rich to proofread. So thank you very much for that, Rich. I wasn't going to actually mention this on the show, but I did think that that was possibly the best pre-advance bit on the bench that I'd seen for some time. Rich, you've done a really nice job on that. Now everyone here is rolling their eyes and saying, "You're biased, Sydney. You were always going to say that," and it is true. I'm probably not always going to say that, but I do think that it looks very nice, Rich. I mean, the visual quality of it, I think, ticked all the boxes, but I think it was really well written as well. So that could be a pre-advanced bit on the bench.
That's right. You can say so. Actually, I am really pleased with the way it's looking. I would never have thought of that as the best bit on the bench, but I suppose it's the only thing on my bench at the moment. I have to say, I think that the images painted by Jim Ibbotson really are spectacular and add to it hugely. I'm really pleased with the cover image that Chris Collingwood, the famous military artist, has painted. And he's actually just painting a new cover for us for O Group, which we're very much looking forward to seeing coming to life after we've got Infamy all processed and out the door. So I'm looking forward to seeing what Chris has done there. And John Savage up in Yorkshire has provided some fabulous pictures of his collection. I think it's true to say that John's collection is stunningly beautiful, with a load of Foundry miniatures that he's had for many years and repurposed them for Infamy, and they've been doing the rounds of the shows where he's been running Infamy in places like Partisan. And you know, always attracting attention because they're so beautiful. So it's I think the rules really do look good, and we're now just polishing them up to try and get the text looking as good as the images. So thank you for that. I will accept that as the best bit on my bench, Sydney. Thank you.
That's very kind of you. I mean, I've got to say that it's interesting that you've got photos by both Jim Ibbotson and also from John Savage, because one of the discussions that we had in Club Night the other night was about painted images, photos of painted figures in magazines, online, and how you get a different sort of approach. And I think anyone who sees Jim's figures will agree that Jim's figures on Twitter and in the Infamy rulebook, I mean, they're beautiful. They're works of art. I mean, they're beautifully blended. Yeah. And anyone, I think, who looks at John's figures will see that they're different because they are an amazing Wargames collection. And there's a difference between the two of them. So I'm really, one of the things that I was really, really pleased about was the fact that you had both in the rulebook. So you've also got an artist who's working on figures to an amazing standard like Jim does, but also somebody like John who is working on the war game. And actually when you see John's war games in the flesh, and they are really inspiring as a war gamer, because you can see that somebody's collected terrain, but not a huge amount of terrain. Those aren't massive games, but he collected scenery on the terrain. Again, something which, you know, is eminently reasonable, you know, the hills, the trees and the settlements, but also the figures and the way he's done the figures on a large basis. So I had a Twitter conversation with John about a month ago saying how much I like the bases, and I've tried that out with a couple of units myself, you know, the big base, but then a sort of counter for the individually wounded or killed figures. And what he's done is really created a whole. And I think having both of those in the rulebook really helps, because sometimes you look at Jim's painting and think, well, it's impossible, I can't really do that. It's quite intimidating in a way, in the nicest way. Jim is definitely not an intimidating person. But at the same time, you've got another artist of a different sort who's producing things which are more achievable, but also looking at the whole, which is what John does. So I was really, really pleased that you had both
I
featuring.
think, Nick,
Sorry.
there's a point I'd like to make, but you jump in, Nick, first of all, because I'm looking for something. But
Well, I was just going to say that my reflection there, Sydney, on what you were saying was that there are many, many different aspects of wargaming, aren't there? So there's, you know, the way you paint your figures, there's the terrain you use, there's the way you set your figures up to create the game, there's the rules themselves, there's your gaming space, there's the scenarios you use, there's the campaign. And I think I was just reflecting there as you spoke that actually my own thinking on wargaming is that very much it's an area of trying to be as good as you possibly can in each of those individual areas, you know, to enhance your overall gaming experience. So, you know, you try to get the figures as nice as you can get them, maybe. You try to do your terrain as nice as you can. We'd like a nice gaming room. We want good rules. Each little area of gaming, it's always about actually how can I move up to the next level? What do I need to improve in each of those areas to get even better games? How do I create an even better narrative around the game to engage people more? That whole aspect of the hobby just sprung to the forefront of my mind when you were being so eloquent there, Sid, to tell us about the painting that you're right. You know, the really good pieces of artwork that Jim and his colleagues produce. I mean, John's figures are lovely. There are so many very, very talented figure painters out there playing games and sharing the joys of their figures online. And sometimes you can kind of feel, I'll never be able to match that myself. But actually you can think, well, there's other areas of my gaming where I'm absolutely rocking it. And I'm really, you know, that's a really enjoyable thing to have in your gaming too. But I think it's this quest for constantly trying to get better and better is a sort of theme that I can identify with me anyway. Trying hard, not always succeeding. What have you got there, Rich? We can't see it.
Can't you? Right. Okay. There we go. I mean, this is an image that I've just dropped into the rules in the last 24 hours, so you won't have seen this version. But this is one of John's bases of Roman infantry, and John hasn't, for his Imperial forces, he hasn't used Sabo bases, but he's created his own bases where they're effectively every group is a little vignette. And when they get down to half strength, he's got some half strength ones that he's replaced it with. But you can see here, you know, you've got the Roman legionary dead. You've got another one protecting his wounded comrade with his shield. And it's John's figures that really inspired me with a lot of the ideas for the rules that allow you to create things like the ambush points, things like the rallying points, allow you to create lovely little vignettes that are going to look superb on the table. And his work's the inspiration, so it's right that they're in there.
And it puts me in mind of the photos that we used to see in early editions of Wargames Illustrated. Wargames, what was it? Wargames, was it called Wargames Illustrated? What was the Miniature Wargames? Miniature Wargames back in the 80s, when we saw lots of kind of Peter Gilder, you know, mass battalions, and the kind of way that he would get some energy into those mass battalions by having figures falling wounded and a block of 6 or 8 men, as you say, almost like a mini vignette. And seeing that photo of the work that John's done there, it's very much in that style, which is lovely to see. Really good, a standalone piece of modelling.
Yeah, I mean, John paints far better than I ever could, which is just another reason to want to punch him on the nose. But his terrain is superb and everything. But I can't paint that well, but I can take what he's done in terms of creating my own little model bases and use them as inspiration for, you know, having ideas for making my stuff look as good as I can get it.
I think that's a really good point. I think that's a great point. I think part of the difficulty when you go to a show and you go to a Wargames magazine or maybe a Wargames book, you look at the very top level of whatever anyone's trying to produce. And then on the other hand, when you get to meet people and you maybe look on Twitter, there's more of a development and a learning sort of process. And I think that what you said, Nick, about actually trying to improve each little bit of the hobby, there's a sort of an element of a philosophy there, isn't there, really? You know, you're using the hobby to get to a place that you actually want to get to, which you think that, you know, it's worth getting to. It's trying to just do a little bit better in each thing that you're trying to do. You're trying to improve terrain or scenario or research or whatever it is. And I think that one never wants to be intimidated by the quality of other people's things. It's really a journey. just as the whole of the war games rules writing has been a journey. I mean, you'd probably know, we've talked about it before, I don't ever decry those terrible, terrible sort of rules from the 80s or the 90s where you had to go down all those different factor charts to work out how many friends routing, how many friends within 150 paces, all that sort of nonsense, because they were all part of a journey. And you look back on that and think, well, actually, we've progressed from that. Yeah. And I think one of the things I've always taken away from Jim, but in particular John's figures, is that, there's a journey that everyone can get to try and do, as you've mentioned, Rich. Some of those smaller vignettes, or increasing base sizes potentially, or putting figures together in a whole which looks attractive, and then trying to marry that up with the interrelationship with scenery and terrain. And I think that it's all about a self-development process which keeps the hobby fresh, which I think is what most of us have found really interesting and also challenging about lockdown. It's doing other things that we possibly might not normally have done. Rich?
I think that the point you're making is an excellent one, and I know that the results I get in terms of my figure collection are a lot better now than they were 25 years ago. But that isn't because I've got better at painting, it's because I've learned techniques that I've seen other people use and thought, I can use that. It doesn't make me technically more competent, it just means they're almost tricks of the trade. And by learning those tricks, you can get your output to improve tremendously. And as I say, just if you can make a unit look a lot bigger by looking at the pictures on page 57 of the rules and saying, I love what he's done with that group, what I'm going to do is I'm going to model in, a guy who's fallen over and is protecting himself by holding his shield up, and that will make my unit look better. I bet it will. And then you'll think, actually, I could also have another one who's, throwing a pillar, or doing something different out of the ordinary, and that's a little technique you've learned, which you'll probably use again and again and again, and it will get things just looking a bit more attractive. So yeah, it is a journey. It's very much a journey, like Nick was saying.
Well, that's been a fantastic workshop. I really enjoyed that, actually. So we've got our best bit on the bench, which is Infinity, and a huge shout out both to Jim Edson and to John Savage. I think although not best bits, guys, they certainly have been inspiring us during the last few months. Anyway, so we can probably now move from the workbench to think about our big issue.
Sydney Roundward. He's got red trousers.
So we're back on the sofa of sincerity, just by the couch of contemplation, for our big issue for this oddcast. So gentlemen, I hope you're both sitting comfortably. And I think that it's fair to say that lockdown hasn't proved to be temporary. I remember when we were driving over to Southampton thinking, oh, well, hopefully it'll all be over in a couple of weeks, but it hasn't been. But during the course of our wargaming coronavirus lockdown, we had been worried at certain times that it was going to be the end of our wargaming, but over the course of the last 3 months, we found that it definitely hasn't been. And it's really obliged many of us to rethink the way that we game as wargamers, what we do, and the way that we do it. So I thought today our big issue was going to be how we do wargaming in lockdown. Now, I know both of you have been doing more gaming than you anticipated, and I thought we could discuss about how to go about designing and developing games online. What works, what doesn't work, and throw out a few ideas that the listeners may find helpful. And in the course of that, we'll be able to talk about some of the games that we've arranged, that we've played in, and some of the things which are wargaming activities which aren't necessarily wargaming gaming, but are social aspects of wargaming which have nevertheless been really helpful. So, gentlemen, with that introduction, I thought we'd start off with Nick by asking you what games you've played and how they went.
Well, so I feel a bit of a wargaming fraud to some degree in this kind of period of lockdown, because although I've been wargaming...
It's not just in this period of lockdown, mate. You
Drat. Although I've been wargaming, only one of those games has involved actually pushing any figures about a table, and that was when we played What a Tanker with the family. Apart from that, I haven't pushed any figures around any table or played really any games whatsoever. And I'm watching people playing Zoom games, and playing games by Zoom where they're moving figures around tables and receiving instructions by the power of technology to play those games. And I'm thinking that must be quite good fun. But the route that we've taken instead is to go back towards more Kriegspiel. We've been playing more Kriegspiel games. We've been designing games on Discord. I think we said in the past that since lockdown, there's hardly been a day when Richard and I have not been running a game on Discord. And that's been really, really interesting, and is enabling us to think about the way that we design and deliver those games and the technology that we use. And I'm liking Discord more and more and more each time we use it.
Yeah.
And really thinking that it's got lots of viability for engaging methods of gaming going forward. We played a what do you call it, a Roll20. We played an RPG, didn't we? The three of us. It was run by Jeremy.
We did.
It was rather fun, if a bit bizarre at times. And that was interesting way to game too. That was an interesting way to spend a Friday evening. It wasn't quite what I thought it would be, but it was fun, wasn't it?
It was certainly very liquid. Yeah, I liked it. It was good fun pushing over that old lady and stuff like that.
Yes, well, it was. We did a Wild West game that Jeremy set for us, or role play game stroke Cthulhu. First time we've ever really done anything like that, so that was eye opening in terms of how that worked, and getting insight into the, what do you call it, dungeon master, games master role.
It was quite funny because he completely wrong-footed us, because we were all expecting a load of werewolves to come running out of the swirling mist, but it wasn't anything like that at all. It was just a pretty straight. It was. I tell you what, it reminded me of. It reminded me. It was like we were Scooby-Doo and his gang, and we come across that old Wild West town with only a few inhabitants in it, and somebody had. The pesky meddling kids were trying to stop the bad guys doing stuff, but it was good fun.
It was definitely a Scooby-Doo moment. I thought that, yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of Kriegspiel, though, we've gone, I guess, in three directions with it. I mean, we've done some games which have been fairly role play orientated, and we're designing some as well. With those, I'm working on a wargames Dare game, which has involved me getting some castle plans, some castle blueprints, and literally working out layer by layer, floor by floor, a design layout for Schloss Adler from Where Eagles Dare.
Grand designs. You'll be on that.
Well, I've been using Photoshop to create, layer 1, level -1, layer 2, then the map to the village. So it's got a lot of this designing landscapes done online, which is going to be really good fun to create a game like that. So that's a kind of almost an RPG type existence. And the great thing about these games is once you design the template, of course, there's nothing really to stop you rolling that out with different groups of players. It's just like designing a scenario that you would for any other war game. You design it in terms of the objectives and forces involved and what the terrain and landscape is. The process is the same. And then, of course, the more you put into that, the more players are able to absorb it and get involved in the detail and buy into the narrative and create an experience. So supporting these games online with various forms of media is an important way to go.
So I'm going to stop you there, and let's just unpack some of those ideas, because it's all very well sort of people describing what they've done, and it has all been a really great process. All the games I've played and I've really enjoyed. But for people who perhaps haven't done it before, or might be nervous or confused about exactly what on earth to actually put out before their friends, let's have a think about the different stages of designing a game and putting a game on. So let's have a think about how long you'd think that you were going to work on the development of a game. Let's also think about where you start. Do you start from a historical event? Or do you start from one reference book? Or do you start just from an idea? And then as a third point, what about the actual physical elements of the maps? How do you deal with that? So, work around those types of thoughts as to how you actually get started here. Rich?
Well, I've been taking a very traditional view and running some classic 1824 Kriegspiels. Because we've done a lot of Kriegspiel games, which, as Nick says, have really had a huge element of role-playing in them. It's certainly true that every Kriegspiel really ends up feeling like a role play because you're playing the role of somebody else. You're playing the role of a military commander, and you are interacting with other people who are your subordinates. And when a messenger rides up and says, "Got a message for you, sir," yes, you read the message, but you can also talk to the messenger. What did you see as you rode back? What route did you take? Things like that. So the role-playing element is very strong in even a sort of classic 1824 Kriegspiel. So for me, the world that I have been inhabiting has been the world of the metal map and the extended metal map, which basically I took this black and white map, which I then colorized just using Photoshop or something like that, I can't remember which, by dropping transparencies on top in terms of colouring in the roads, red for main roads, you know, very much like the old sort of Bartholomew's maps of England, and green on the woods and the water meadows and things like that, blue on the rivers. And that created a really nice map that I've been able to use for the games. But the detail on there is already created because we've got those maps. You know, we've got the Meckel map, we've got the Metz map, we've got the Königgrätz map, which cover colossal areas of ground. But I really particularly like the Meckel map because it was the first one that I ever used, and it is the original German copy, whereas the Metz map and the Königgrätz map were redraws, fairly modern redraws of old maps. But the original has got lots of period detail, so it really looks like a 19th century map.
So one of the first things that we might say as regards the planning stage, possibly, is not to have to design your own map, not to have to draw your own map, but to take a map which is available elsewhere and customize it.
Exactly right. So, you know, Google is a wonderful thing. You can Google old maps of Germany, okay, and you can get some old maps of Germany that could be really helpful to you. But, and this is a very obvious but actually. If so, for instance, I was looking for an old map of Heidelberg, so I put in old map Heidelberg, and I got some really interesting results for old map Heidelberg. But as soon as I changed my search term, of course, to Altstadtplan Heidelberg, I've got some really interesting results. So, of course, searching in English is good, but if you can search in another language, you can get some really interesting results. And I've got some fantastic hits from that as well, because the Schloss Lard game that I'm using is based on the castle I'm using is based on Heidelberg Castle. So it's really, you know, helpful to start with a base like that. For me, in terms of Kriegspiel, normally the idea and the map come very close together. Sometimes the map gives you the idea for the game, but sometimes the idea will come a little bit first, but actually you can't develop the idea until you get the map. I often say in Kriegspiel, it's all about the map, because the map is the first thing the players get their teeth into, and it's what they will use to plan the campaign. And therefore the way that the map orientates, for instance, you know, often when you get a map, the really interesting terrain features are sometimes towards the edge of the map, and it's quite difficult to then make that the center of the Kriegspiel. So you have to then think, does the game idea work with the map that I'm looking at? Does it have enough interesting points that could provide opportunities for action or cavalry patrols or paths of advance? And we played a game recently, Richard and I. Actually, we were very lucky to be able to play in a game of Kriegspiel that was run by Andy Crow, and he did a fantastic job for Kriegspieling, for umpiring his first Kriegspiel, particularly seeing as he had myself and Richard, you know, commanding various elements of the game. And he used a lovely map, a very map of Kent, and the southeast approaches into London from Maidstone up towards Greenwich, and we did a Napoleonic invasion pushing towards London. And the map was beautiful, you know. And this really is the key thing: to have a really good map. Find a good map. Find a way you can share it with others. That's legal. Okay, if you're going to do it for your own purposes, that's all fine, and it's good fun. Rich.
When you're creating a role-playing game, the first thing you need to do is to create a plausible environment in which it is set, so everything makes sense. When you're creating a Kriegspiel, the map does it for you. If you've got a period map that, as that was, I don't know when that was, but it was from somewhere around 1800, and we were using it for a campaign set in 1805, or immediately you're sucked into the narrative that period map presents. and so that kind of does the job for you. And it's important to get the right map for the right campaign. I mean, one of the Kriegspiels I'm looking at running is going to be about 1970s mercenaries in Africa. So what do? I've got a pile of maps of Rhodesia which I've pulled out, and immediately you're sucked into that environment. It looks like 1970s Africa because it was 1970s Africa. It's the perfect map for that game. But then what you've got to say, as Nick says, is there enough going on this map for what I want? So if you want to create a fictitious capital city or major provincial city, there's got to be a major city on the map. So it's a case of finding a map that looks interesting and inspiring. Not every map will have that.
And being able to Google those maps is pretty easy, and doing it in a foreign language, I think, is a great tip. You're going to find so much more detailed maps and different scaled maps and interesting maps if you're Googling in French or German or Spanish than you would do if you're just Googling in English. I think that's certainly true.
And
so
looking at terminology as well. So, for example, in Germany today, they tend not to call Kriegspiels, they call them Planspiels, they're planning games. So knowing that means that you don't just search on Kriegspiel, you search on Planspiel, and that can potentially bring up more results.
That's very useful. That's good. So the next stage is that you've got a map. Then people perhaps might be thinking, or listeners might be thinking, well, how much research do I need to do? How much work do I need to do? Because what I really want to try and do is have a game with my friends. That's probably what people might be thinking. I want to stage a game for my friends, arrange that as a social activity because I can't meet face to face. How much work is involved in running a game? How much research would you think of doing on the books as opposed to the map itself?
What I'd say here is that the thought that comes into my head foremost is that it's quite intimidating to attempt to run a Kriegspiel game if the players know more about the period than you do. because therefore, of course, you know that they're going to ask you questions that you're going to find difficult to answer. But having said that, of course, what better way to learn the answer than to be posed with the question and try to work out the answer and plan that through. I don't know if that answers your question really, Sid. Can you ask it again, because I've forgotten it already.
How much work you would anticipate needing to do?
A fair bit.
A map.
What does a fair bit mean? So you need to think about what forces you think you're going to be using for this particular game, for the scenario, and what the command structure would be like, what logistical support could be for them, what's the reasonable historical context for the game, what's the capabilities of the troops involved. Those kind of questions run through for that. And if you can answer all of those, put yourselves in the minds of the commanders, because imagine that you've given yourself the brief of leading that French brigade up the A20 towards Greenwich. Well, what kind of questions is this guy likely to ask me? He's likely to ask me, what's the state of the rivers like? What are the bridges? What do we know about the bridges? What do we know about enemy dispositions? So thinking ahead and asking yourself the kind of questions that you think the players will ask you helps you to give them a credible answer, because of course you've got to make sure you've got to be consistent in the answers you give your players. You can't tell one player one thing and another player another, unless you're consciously attempting to inject a bit of friction, of course, which is perfectly reasonable from time to time. But I think having that understanding and also having the confidence as an umpire of what you say goes, is important. And I think credibility comes, the more games you do, the more credible you become, and the more fun you have. And certainly there are people. I always go back to Paddy Griffith and the work that we did. The fun we had with Paddy, Richard, playing those games that, and I know you played more with him than I did. As an umpire, his ability to just control the game and just have the answers and just know the full scope of the engagement he was trying to create really helped drive engagement in the game and made the game more plausible. What would you say to that, Rich?
I'd say the thing that I really learned from Paddy was just to have the balls to make your decision. But in order to make decisions which are credible and plausible, you have to have done some preparation in terms of considering what's the weather like, what time of year is it, the troops that have just entered the map at that point, have they been marching for 20 minutes? Have they been marching for 2 days? And but once you've established that basic framework, it's just having the balls to make up an answer that sounds plausible, and then you making a note of that, so that you know, if somebody says, what is the state of the banks of the river at this point, you've got to be able to look at the map and make a decision and say, well, you know, is that a major road between 2 towns? If so, it's likely to be a stone bridge. If not, if it's between 2 villages and it looks like it's on a track, well, it can just be a wooden footbridge that's used to take geese to market on a Wednesday. But once you've done that, you've got to make a note of that and be consistent to that story. But you don't have to know everything in the run up to it. You've just got to give a sensible answer and stick to that story.
And of course, Google Maps can be your friend these days as well. So if you're using a real map, then you can go into Google Maps. You can check out, you know, look at some stuff there. If you're, particularly for Second World War games, have used this quite a lot. You know, what can you see from that hilltop? Well, let's go on Google Maps and actually have a look and see what we can see from that hilltop. And you can do it that way. And how far do people move in an hour? You know, you need to have some kind of answers to what's the rate of advance going to be, and are we going to be, you know, as Richard said, are we fresh? How far does infantry go in an hour? How far does cavalry go? How far can they see? Just have that. And the Kriegspiel, the basic Kriegspiel rules include some information that will help you with that. But you know, it is only you're going to struggle to use those straight from the book. I'd strongly advise anybody who's interested in Kriegspiel to get the 2 versions that you know, to plug a product, to plug a TooFatLardies product, or at least something that we are able to provide people with. Then the 2 versions of Kriegspiel that are on the TooFatLardies website are well worth getting hold of. But also, you know, you can ask, looking at anybody, how far does it take to go between A and B? How fast does an armored car go down a road? Well, the fact that it can go at 50 doesn't mean it does go at 50.
No.
So you know, some things are helpful. I'll tell you a little tip that I use when I'm doing my Discord games of World War II, and I'm doing distances and speed between things. When I'm doing Google Maps, I look at how far it takes to cycle, and the cycle speed I think of as being almost an armored advance speed. So it can give you an indicator. If you've got nothing else to go on, you know, it's a start point at least. And if you're consistent in what you use, then you're being fair to both sides.
Is that your cycling speed, Nick, or mine?
My cycling speed is very fast downhill.
That's great.
I would agree with everything you say about the original Kriegspiel rules. I find the combat resolution system that is in there to be quite detailed. And if I am running which is fine if you are in the mess and you've got subalterns who can crunch those numbers for you as you're a German colonel. But I'm not a German colonel, and I don't have a whole selection of subalterns hanging around here waiting to crunch those numbers. So I use these, 1 yellow dice and 1 red dice, and I roll the dice. And in this case, red has rolled 4, and red has rolled 1, and yellow has rolled 4. Well, you know, that's a relatively reasonable margin of victory. So, and then you make a decision based on that. You don't need really to track casualties on units. You know that you know that they've been in combat for 10 minutes and they're losing. So what are they going to do? Well, if they're fresh, they're probably going to stick around. But if they roll that again in 10 more minutes' time, well, their skirmishers are being driven in, and the enemy's potentially advancing on them. But it's just having the confidence to make those decisions and make decisions that are plausible to the players who are involved in the game, because if you start doing things that are not plausible, you lose your audience.
Yeah. So thinking about the way that Paddy used to do that, funnily enough, I've written a piece for WSS, but whether the guy publishes it or not, who knows? But there's something about Kriegspiel in there, and this idea of the free Kriegspiel, which is something that Paddy was a proponent of, which is it takes a lot of the number crunching out of the basic Kriegspiel and applies a much more freer approach. And it's often seen by other people as this is where the umpire makes it up as he goes along. Now, of course, if somebody as knowledgeable as Paddy was making some very professional, expert decisions and looking like he was making it up as he was going. But of course he wasn't. He was applying all his expertise and skill around the historical situation and also the game situation to create some really smooth flowing outcomes. So you might for on a six-sided, if you just wanted to use a six-sided dice to determine outcomes, you could do that. You might see, well, if an identical force of red and blue meet together and the situation, it's the same, it's a unit of cavalry and they're the same strength, the same freshness, there's nothing between them. Well, what are the potential outcomes? Well, a marginal win for red, a marginal win for blue, or a draw. So you go, well, okay, so a 1 would be a marginal win for red, a 6 would be a marginal win for blue, and 2 to 5 would be a draw. If you then say, well, actually, red cavalry are fresh and blue cavalry have done a night march, you might have to change those dice scores. So you'd say, well, in that case, perhaps red more likely now to get a significant victory. And then you can change your dice through that way. But of course, all the while you're only using a D6, you're only getting a D6 range of outcomes. So you need to start thinking about how do you get more of a bell curve, more of a distribution of outcomes. And that's where 2D6 will help you a little bit more than just using 1D6. And Rich's method with the two opposite dice, all these things are different ways of determining outcomes. Most of them are not rocket science, and most of them will apply in different situations equally smoothly.
Yeah, I agree. Paddy only ever used to use a D6. He never used a post roll. We would just say, right, what's the most extreme result at one end of the spectrum, and what's the most extreme result at the other, and then what happens in between. And he would just roll a D6 and base his decisions on that. I don't like linear dice rolls very much. I don't like potential linear results. I much prefer a bell curve, but equally. So I could do exactly the same thing with 2D6 and go blue complete victory at one end, red complete victory at the other, and I've rolled 9. Well, that's it's 7 is the middle point. It's only 2 off that, so it's a minor victory, and red is starting to push blue back, but it's still in the balance. But as I say, I prefer an opposed roll because to me it gives me a big range of results. Sid.
Very good. So we've got our basic map, we've got our information which informs the map and the game, we've got some of our mechanics. What are the things to really avoid as regards an online game? What hasn't worked particularly well, and what can we say to listeners about, or what kind of pitfalls to avoid? Do we have anything along those lines, guys?
Yeah, it's been a real learning curve doing this using Discord, and certainly one of the things that I think that we didn't know at the outset was how much time would be involved in this, how much time people would have to devote to this. And there have been instances where I said to people, look, this is going to be a really low intensity game. Don't worry about it. You're going to be going online for maybe a couple of times a day for 10 minutes each time. It's not going to get in the way of your work. And that's a complete load of bollocks. It's turned out to be, an experience that you're almost living minute by minute. And that's not fair, because some people have had to say to me, look, Rich, you are a lying bastard, and I'm going to be fired if I keep spending this much time not at my work desk. And now I'm stating that in an extreme way, but it's certainly been the case that you need to have some kind of understanding of how much time is going to be invested when you're doing it, or you need to have people who can commit to giving as much time as is required. We've also had an issue with using people in very different time zones, which is fine if you are playing a leisurely game where all people have to do is log in once a day, get their instruction, get the reports that they're having, and then provide their response, and then everything lags about 24 hours behind. That's fine, but it's not fine when you've got things happening minute by minute. I was very aware that we had a major offensive just south of the Somme River, and the guy whose division was being hit by this, or corps was being hit by this, was asleep in Australia when everybody else was fighting their way through his positions. That's completely unfair on that guy to have done that. But that's part of the learning curve.
For sure it is, and I think that the as umpires, I think we're as guilty of that as anybody, because
Oh,
it's our game, we've created it, we want people to move the narrative forward.
yeah.
So it's very typical that we would respond. We're almost living it, waiting for the response to come in, and then jump on it straight away. So sometimes we drive that forward at a pace that others can't keep up with. But also, I think, to be truthful, it's also the players themselves that drive it forward with speed. So one of the things, of course, you really want when you're designing these games is for players to really get into it, and to really embed themselves or engage with the process. What does that really mean? Well, it really means they're asking loads of questions. It means that they're making lots of plans, they're discussing lots of things with their colleagues, they're really in there with it. And it's very easy as an umpire to spend all your time with that person, because you can, and move their timeline forward very, very quickly. Whereas there's, of course, other players that you need to also be bringing on at the same rate to keep the balance in the game. Otherwise, you can find, well, I think the experience of the game can be very different. Therefore, one player can have a very, very fantastic and good fun and intense game. Another player could potentially sit there and say, well, nothing much happened there, did it, Rich?
Yeah, very much so, and that's something you need to be aware of when you're creating your briefs. I ran a game for the WSS crew.
Good point.
And one of the guys was responsible for bringing up a column of reinforcements. And of course, he's got decisions to make in that. It started raining. There's a big barn over there. Your orders say march with all alacrity and get to the battlefield quickly. But it started to rain. What are you going to do? And we had a situation where he said, look, I think my guys, they've been marching for so long. I think it would be better if we had a rest now, and that would mean that we would get to the battlefield slightly later, but fresh and ready to fight. And he was absolutely right in that respect. But what it meant was he didn't get there in time to take part in the game. And you can't tell him that because he might pass that information on to his colleagues who are waiting for him to appear on their right flank, and a bit like Wellington waiting for Blucher. But in this game, Blucher's not going to turn up, and you know that as umpire, but you can't tell people that. So it created, by allowing the player to have that degree of input, I created a situation completely unintentionally, which meant the gentleman concerned probably had an absolutely, well, not just a bad game, but a game that didn't exist, because he was having a kip in a barn and frying bacon at the side of the road before commencing his march, which is, perfectly legitimate decision, but it took him out of the game. However, hopefully the other people in that game had a great game because they were really involved and having the opportunity to make really key decisions. But you need to be aware of that when you're creating roles.
One of the ways that I've learned from exactly that process is that sometimes if you map out all the roles at the beginning of the game, some of the roles become redundant because somebody makes a decision that therefore means that they're going to be out of the game. We've all played probably big tabletop battles where you've got 4 players commanding the Allied army I don't know, it could be a Peninsular War battle, and there's always some guy who's sitting on the left doing nothing because all the action's going on the right. Well, the Kriegspiel equivalent of that is exactly that Rich just described. It's the fact that somebody makes a decision, you command a column of guys that goes nowhere, meets nobody, does nothing. So one of the ways that I've got around that in the games that I've been running is actually start with a couple of players, with 2 or 3 players who make the initial plan, and then you get your second wave of players, your second wave is a fair way to put it, I suppose. The second group of players who come in and you give them the roles, or they take on the roles that are going to have the more interesting storylines attached to them. So that bringing people in bit by bit, of course, also allows you to inject different types of energy in the game and allows you to explore different narratives. And it works with people who want to have different inputs. Not everybody's available from the very beginning. Some people are only available for a bit of input here and there. So it works with them. Sid?
I think that comes back to one of my final points, is how many people is the right number for a game? I mean, you're talking in your 1918 Kriegspiel about a very large number of international players. We've obviously played, you and me, Nick, in games where there's only about 3 or 4 players, and we had around about 7 or 8 people on the role-playing game that we talked about the other weekend. How many people do you think is the right number, or maybe there isn't a right number?
11.
The right number, actually, Sid, the question you should be asking is, what's the right number of umpires?
Yeah.
Okay, because it's the right number of umpires that would dictate what a game can cope with.
Yeah. The busiest in the Kriegspiel is the umpire.
Yeah.
And if you don't have enough umpires to support you, the whole thing, the wheels are going to come off. And funnily enough, a lot of people go, oh, I don't want to be an umpire. I certainly don't want to be an assistant umpire. Actually, being an umpire is one of the most interesting roles because you have the God's eye view of what, not only what's happening, but what could happen. And you get to see it minute by minute as it unfolds. Whereas the players obviously don't have that same omnipresence.
So let's think about this from a pretty obvious example. If the three of us played the Kriegspiel, we'd have one person playing the red team, one person playing the blue team, and one umpire. Now, as soon as we add in 2 extra people, you double the work for the umpire.
Yeah.
Okay, so because actually I've gone from supporting 2 players as an umpire to supporting 4 players as an umpire. And if those players are in different parts of the map doing different things, as they probably are, because that's where you want them to have an interesting game, then you have doubled your workload. If you then add another player, you can see how this stacks up. So what you ideally want in a game, let's say you've got a game with 3 players aside, you probably want at least 2 umpires to run that. One handling the red, one handling the blue. And in bigger games, you probably need a coordinating umpire and an umpire that's looking after each of the key roles on the other teams. So, the games, for instance, that we played with Paddy, I mean, these were big games of about 50 players. He had something like a dozen umpires, and even that wasn't enough. So I think if you're playing a game with I don't know, let's say you've got 4 people aside, you want 2 umpires and 3 if you can get it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's absolutely key to get that balance right. That then allows. I don't think an umpire should really be handling more than three players. So if you've got 4 people aside is a difficult one because it kind of falls between 2 stools, doesn't it? Really, you in a way you might be better off having 5 players aside, but then having 5 umpires in total, or whatever, 4 umpires in total. You get 2 people running each side. But in an ideal world, you want one core umpire who's handling the map movement and working out the combat resolution. What happens when Patrol A hits Patrol B? And you then want the support umpires going back with messages, writing the messages right. What's happened here is that this combat patrol has met this one. You better go back and give them that information. Now that umpire then needs to look at the map, work out how long it would take to write this message, work out how long it would then take for the galloper to get from point A to point B, and that then gives him the time that they would present that information to the player. Because there's a time lag in a black powder period Kriegspiels, which has to be taken into account. So if you get a message and it's 8:30 and it says enemy cavalry on the river at town A, and that message is dated 8 o'clock, well, where are those cavalry now? I bet they're not at town A. They're probably 5 miles outside town A now.
Yeah, and most likely the umpire is going to be dedicating his own resource to those people that are closest to the action point. So if you've got a chain of command and those players are able to communicate through a chain of command, if you're doing a World War II Kriegspiel, for instance, where there's radio comms, as an umpire, I would probably expect to be spending most of my time in the channel with the guys who are out there doing the fighting. And I probably don't need to go into the commander's channel very much because he is just receiving updates by radio from his team and giving instructions to them. So you don't need an umpire to keep going back and forth to him because he's actually managing and making the decisions directly to his commanders who are then making the decisions. So in a more modern Kriegspiel, where the communication is more instant or more available, and you're allowing the player to have a direct communication with his commander, the umpire doesn't need to go into that commander. He just stays with the player. So that can help you. But Richard's right, in the horse and musket stuff, of course, you've got all the messengers and delayed messages and what's been written down and what route does the messenger take, etc. And how long does he take? Where does he go to? You know, you said I'm going to send a message to General Grouchy. Well,
Yeah.
okay, where is he?
Yeah.
Where are you going to send the message and how does he get there and what route does he take? So in the game that Andy Crow played or ran for Richard and I, you know, he was asking me, okay, you're sending a message to you know, your commander of the other column, where are you sending the messenger and how's he going to what route's he going to take? You know, because obviously if he goes down this side of the river, then he's unlikely to encounter enemy patrols, but if he crosses the river and drives on and goes on the other side of the river, he's likely to you know, he may be captured. So you've got to think about those things. As an umpire, it's really easy to have that take up your whole mindset. Where are the messengers? How are they running? What messages arrived? What delay does it need? Etc. etc. So, you know, doing it on your own is very difficult.
Yeah, it really is. It really is, and you cannot overstress how much work is involved. But the good thing is, talking about how we run these games. You know, we've talked about Discord, but you know, we've been having a dabble with that, and Discord allows us to introduce voice channels. So if you've got people who are in radio communication, they can have that open. You've even got video channels which would allow people to, you know, to meet face to face. So it's turning out to be a tool that the more we use it, the more we discover what flexibility it has.
I'm really liking it, really enjoying exploring it. Plus it has little, what they call bots. Some of these bots you can add into the Discord channel are quite helpful. For instance, there's one that enables you to roll dice. And some of the bots are really quite annoying. So it would, for instance, one of the bots that I trialed that wasn't very successful was this idea that you could have a level within the game. So the more engaged you became, you went up through the level, you know, like a reward. It's just crap. It just didn't work, and it just annoyed people. Every time they post a message, it would say, "You've got a level 6. Well done."
Well, fantastic stuff. Okay, so that's probably all my questions that I had. I mean, a few closing words from the two of you on online gaming.
Do it more. Have a go. Come and tell me do it more. I mean, we're always interested in expanding our community of Discorders, and so you can reach out to us for that. And I know that other people are also trying to run games, and we're really happy to help or fill in assistant umpire roles, you know, as needed with those. And just do it. I mean, we can't physically be together to game, and at the moment this is really scratching an itch. So yeah, go for it.
It's a different type of game, but it's equally satisfying. I mean, I did play a game on Zoom that we're using now to record this. That played a game of Infamy with John Savage up in Yorkshire, and with Charlie up in Scotland, and with Jeremy over in Lancashire, and here, there, and everywhere, really, I think. And it was different but good fun. It was good fun to play a figure game, and you really felt like you were there having a game with your mates. It was just like playing a figure game at the club. What it did need was John had, who was running it, had two channels open in Zoom. One with one phone. He's got two phones. I think one's a work phone and one's his. So he was able to have one phone set up showing the table, and the other he would use to go around and give you close-up details of exactly what was happening at any point. But it really was a good fun game. Kriegspiel is very different. It's a very different experience, but in a way it's more immersive, because you are transported into the world of that 1800 map, and you are making decisions based on you're making decisions based on limited information. So you're living that command experience.
So it's funny you mentioned about playing with John and also doing a game which is remote but on the tabletop, because very shortly we have virtual lard coming up, which plus we can't do deep fried lard next week. We haven't been able to do Evesham this week. We are going to be helping out and participating in virtual lard. Now, Rich, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I don't know anything about it at all. I've had an email from Jeremy in Bury in Lancashire, who said, hi, we're running this. And I said, listen, mate, I'll be there, but I'm so tied up with Infamy, I honestly haven't got time even to read about what's going on. So all I know is it's happening. I don't know when it's happening. I don't know what's happening, but I know I'll be there.
I think it's the same as me. I think it might. I think it might be the 20th.
It is. I know that.
20th of June. I'm the same as you. I said, yes, I'd very much like to participate. I don't quite know the details. But I think there's a game of infamy, there's a couple of games of sharp practice, there's a
8 games there or something like that.
Yeah, there are I think 7 games at the moment, or maybe more. So as a proof of concept, it's going to be very interesting to see how it runs through. Great to be able to connect to people at least. And I think even he's planning even to have a like a virtual pub afterwards where people.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
So I don't know quite how that will work.
A virtual piss up sounds like my kind of gig.
So that's going to be interesting, and I think all these things we're learning in lockdown, the good parts will stay and we'll make use of them in the future, and the bits that don't work will just drop by the wayside. So it's going to, I think in the long term, it will strengthen gaming connections and develop the way we game.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's been a learning experience, and it's provided us with some weapons that we can put in our arsenal of gaming and use in the future. Like this Zoom that we're running. I mean, we were using it as the free version. I've now committed and subscribed to the full version because it works, and it's a good way of just having a conversation. If Nick and I are working in different places, we can still have a face-to-face conversation and discuss ideas for whatever project we're working on.
And same with me with Discord. The way we're learning how to use that and the technology, and that's really interesting for our gaming.
Any books on it in your library of weirdo books?
Books on what? On
how
virtual gaming.
Online.
I'll tell you what though. I mean, I know we're not really doing books. I don't think this time round, are we? But I've been reading this book.
Oh, Bruce Quarry.
I must have read that book.
Okay, so it's
going
back. And it's, and he says in there about simultaneous movement, and I was just pondering that actually games these days, and I know we haven't got time to go into this, but games these days don't really use simultaneous movement. We tend to use phases or turns, and simultaneous movement has tended to disappear by the wayside, but not in a Kriegspiel, because in a Kriegspiel, of course, the whole thing is one big exploration of simultaneous movement. And it's just grabbing that book this morning and flicking through it, and then thinking that conversation we just had just made me ponder on the fate of simultaneous moves and how Kriegspiel is one of the few ways that it now still exists in the hobby, I believe.
Thank God.
Sorry. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Is it?
I do. I bloody do.
Well, is that partly because in a Kriegspiel you always have an umpire?
Yeah.
So
I think it probably is.
Friction, if you like, relating to simultaneous movement goes out, whereas simultaneous movement on the tabletop is always a bit of a nightmare, because if you don't have an umpire, everyone's moving simultaneously. Who starts first, and when do you move, and are you looking at your opponent? And
it's
those never really.
It's a fight waiting to happen. It really is.
Well, so so has the hobby gone away from simultaneous movement? I think it depends on simultaneous. Depends on what's the time scale. Let's not go into that now, but it's a big issue that we could perhaps revisit.
That is a big issue. It's one worth talking about, because there are ways that we introduce some of the aspects of simultaneousness, simultaneous things happening at the same time, whatever the bleeding term should be, but without actually doing it like that. Simultaneously.
Simultaneity or something.
I've made that word up. It's a good one.
Well, that's probably a perfect point to finish when we've finished our first big issue and we've moved on. Before we move on to a second big issue, that's probably about all we've got time for this weekend.
We could end the show simultaneously.
We can. We should. So, on that simultaneous note, I'd like to thank Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, and I hope all of you have a very pleasant rest of the weekend and stay healthy, and we will see you next time. Good night.
Keep 'em peeled.
Good night.